Welcome to Decarceration Nation, a podcast about radically reimagining America's criminal justice system. You can find all previous episodes on our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. And if you like the podcast, please remember to hit like and to subscribe to the channel below. Hannah Riley is a writer and organizer based in Atlanta. She works as the communications director for the Southern Center for Human Rights, a nonprofit law office working on behalf of people impacted by the criminal legal system in the Deep South, and that's a lot of work. And organizes with Georgia Freedom Letters, an abolitionist collective working to build relationships with incarcerated people in Georgia through letter writing. Welcome to the Decarceration Nation podcast, Hannah.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Happy to be here.
My pleasure. I always ask the same first question. How did you get from wherever you started in life to being the communications director at the Southern Center for Human Rights?
Oh no, this is such a boring answer. I'm so sorry. I studied psychology as an undergraduate, and I started to get very interested in false confessions my sophomore year, and that led me down many a rabbit hole. It's hard to study psychology without clearly bumping into the reality that prisons are incredibly damaging and horrifying on many levels, but
strangely not good for mental health.
Oddly, yeah. Who would have thunk that putting people in cages would be detrimental to their mental health? So yeah, I was a psychology major. I got very, very interested in prisons in college, and then I went to the Innocence Project after graduation, started working in communications there. And I think wrongful convictions are a good lens to sort of look at these broader issues within the criminal legal system. The more you learn about that, the more you can sort of start to unravel the thread. So I was at the Innocence Project for a number of years. I have a lot of fondness for that work and for the people doing it, but it became apparent to me that I really wanted to broaden away from just wrongful convictions, cases of actual innocence. And in 2017, after 2 years of not living in the United States, taking something of a break from this, I saw a listing for this job at the Southern Center, which had been on my radar for a very long time as a place doing really, really principled work in this area. Got the job, moved to Atlanta. It was the first time I had been to Georgia, aside from going there for one day for my interview. So a very steep learning curve, but I've been there since September 2017 now. And I love it. So that's the boring answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Not sure it's boring. I guess it depends on who's listening and what they, but I
True.
That wasn't boring to me. I don't know. It's definitely subjective. But how did you get to dig a little deeper into what could or could not be a boring answer? How did starting in psychology get you to communications? I guess is the part that I feel like might need
Good question. A little more fleshing out. Yeah. So I originally had thought that sort of the only way to do meaningful change work around prisons and decarceration and abolition was to become a lawyer. So that had sort of been my initial plan. I think a lot of folks who go and work at law firms, these nonprofit law offices, especially right after college, are kind of doing that for a couple of years and then inevitably going to law school. And my time there, one, made it very clear that I did not want to be a lawyer. And it also made it very clear that public education, in addition to giving incarcerated people the microphone, is, I think, just as, if not as, it's just as important as the very, very crucial legal work and litigation and other liberatory things that attorneys are doing. I wanted to write, and I wanted to help people tell their stories because I felt very strongly that it would be impossible to hear these things, to listen to these stories and not to be moved by them. That is not entirely true. I think the the years of my career have shown me that plenty of people can be exposed to the horrors of incarceration and remain unmoved by it. But yeah, I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and then I saw that narrative work and public education in this way felt like the thing that I was most comfortable doing. And I don't think we need more lawyers. Controversial take, but I think we have enough lawyers.
I definitely don't think that's a controversial take, although I do have a lot of friends who are on the defense side of the law work. So there's a book that the far right uses a lot called Confrontational Politics. And that book, one of its major premises is that public education is basically irrelevant, and what we really need to be doing is riling people up. You said one of your big takes is that you wanted to be more part of public education. I'm just springing that on you, so I know you probably don't have a way to bridge that necessarily. I'm just wondering what you think, as someone who also engages quite a bit in public education, what you think of both kind of that take on how you move the public and how more principled and educational takes can compete in that environment.
I sort of think public education is riling people up. Like they're kind of one thing in my mind. I could talk for hours about whether or not visibility alone and public education alone actually moves the needles on these issues. Like I said, I don't think that history has shown that to be true. That doesn't mean that they're not incredibly important and a part of a larger strategy, organizing for liberation. But I think public education has to have a little element of riling people up. Although I guess that depends on how you're defining riling people up. Radical public education is what I'm trying to go for. And I should say that this is, I'm speaking to you sort of as my position at the Southern Center for Human Rights, but also as an advocate and organizer on my own. There are slight modulations to what I would say depending on the audience, and that is also true of who something is coming from. So Southern Center is in a very different position as an organization that I am as an individual, and sometimes those lines are blurry.
So I decided to ask you to come on after reading an article that you wrote about Georgia's prison system. I will start with a quote partial quote that immediately stood out to me, and which I would assume should have started, in my opinion, a national inquiry. You said that 450 people had died in Georgia's prisons between January of 2020 and September of 2021. I want to say that again because I still can't even get my head around this. You said that 450 people had died in Georgia's prisons between January of 2020 and September of 2021. 450 human beings dead in a little over a year and a half.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit. How is this not a national story? I don't understand why the first I'd heard that that high a number was from you in an article.
I should say that it's not a national story, and frankly, it's barely a story in the state of Georgia. There are lots of reasons for that. Chief among them, and this is fresh in my mind because I've been spending hours in the newspaper.com archives going through pieces about the Georgia prison system from 1940 until now. And it's not hyperbolic for me to say we have been saying the same thing since 1940. The same headlines have been splashed across our newspapers since 1940. It's just this consistent, Georgia prisons are in crisis. What are we going to do about it? Here are some varied ideas. And then we kind of move on. And sometimes there's legislative proposals that go nowhere. Sometimes this means the GDC gets a budget increase. Sometimes this means some sort of federal intervention, federal litigation. But I really think the answer is that this has been going on for as long as many of us can remember. And I think absent real action, people grow tired of hearing about it. They glaze over.
I just know that a couple of years ago I was getting pretty fired up about 31 people dying in Mississippi prisons over, a year, and
Yeah.
I, was very fired up about 144 people dying from COVID in Michigan prisons, but
Yeah.
450 is a whole different level of crazy. And I mean, I still, every time I see that, it makes my eyes just, I just can't even believe that I'm reading that number.
It's
Uh,
astounding. It's astounding. I really appreciate your response to it because that is not everyone's response. And if there were any other state agency that was presiding over this much death, there would have been countless hearings and angry legislators and
Well,
think
think about it.
pieces.
Think about it by percentage of the population in that in prisons. How much of a gigantic? I mean, that's just
Yeah.
that's an unheard of number.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
means someone is
It's
doing an
horrifying.
incredibly bad. I mean, like an unbelievably bad job at doing
Yes.
at managing their prison system,
Yep.
and that's from someone. I mean, I think I mean, I don't mean to sound this. We were saying don't be hyperbolic, but I think I probably have a decent understanding of America's prisons, probably more
I
than the
think
normal
so.
person. So,
Yep.
like, I
I think
keep
that's
up
a
on the
fair
news across
assessment.
the country, and
Yep.
that one made my eyes just bug out of my head. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
I mean, I truly cannot, again, I'm not being hyperbolic. I hear at least once a day an absolute horror story from family members, loved ones of incarcerated folks in Georgia. It it's truly hard to wrap your mind around how heinous and cruel and torturous it is for people living in those facilities. Like I cannot believe that some of them are mere miles from me, and there isn't mass action to go to the prison. And it's astounding. And I don't think it lands with others that way. Maybe they don't have the necessary context. Maybe it just feels so overwhelmingly bad. And how do you begin to touch a system like that? But it's astounding. I just want to keep saying that number is astounding and
I mean,
unbelievably shameful.
there's a lot of times when I get furious about Michigan's prison conditions, and I see something like that, and I have to say, well, at least we're not Georgia. I mean, like, I mean, comparably,
Ours in
we're like
hell.
the best. I hate to say, I feel terrible for y'all.
Yeah.
This is a good bridge. Your organization, as you just mentioned, collected a lot of stories from directly impacted people about this
Yep.
crisis. Can you kind of share about that process and what you all learned from this testimony in a short form? Because we'll go into details in just a second, but I just want to get kind of a feel for what people inside are saying there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So I sort of am interacting with this in two ways. One, as an employee of the Southern Center, and the other as an organizer in Georgia who has multiple loved ones in prisons. At Southern Center, we have an intake process, which has been around for basically as long as the organization. And we're a fairly small outfit, so we are often unable to actually act on the calls that we get, but we feel that it's important to listen, to hear out every person who calls. Often I think we're probably the fifth or sixth place that they've called and been told that they can't be helped. So we get a lot of intake, various horrifying stories. We're going to talk about this more in depth, obviously, but understaffing is at a true crisis point, and there are multiple facilities that are.
Which is it is true all over the country that this is, I
Yep.
mean, again, like we said, we were joking earlier about how prisons don't help mental health. Apparently, they're not a very good place to work either. That's, I know,
Yeah.
shocking for anyone who's spent
Shocking.
time in there. That
Utterly shocking. Yeah. So a lot of the things that we were hearing are a result of, there's always bad understaffing in the GDC. Again, these are horrible jobs that no one wants, so it's understandable. The pandemic has made this much, much, much worse. And, I struggle with talking about understaffing issues because I want to make it very clear that COs are not a source of safety for incarcerated people. In most cases, they're a source of harm. However, it's math, right? The ratio can't be that you have 100% of your incarcerated population there and 30% of the staff. Because what we start to see is things like folks being put into, telephone booth sized holding pens that are meant to keep someone for, under an hour. There's 2 staff on call. Someone gets called into another building where there's an emergency happening, and maybe they don't come back in and get this person for 24 hours, in which, they've gone to the bathroom on themselves because they have nowhere to go. They can't even sit down or lie down. Toilets that are controlled by the guards are not flushed for days or weeks on end. We've had folks who were put into showers where the water temperature was controlled by the guards, who again get pulled away because they're so understaffed, and people are suffering from burns and vomiting from heat exhaustion. Obviously, medical care has never been anything close to sufficient in Georgia prisons, but with the understaffing issues, that is getting considerably worse. So we're hearing about, really preventable medical issues causing deaths. And then also, so outside of my work at Southern Center, hearing from folks in the same way, often family members who have contacted the prison for more information about a loved one. The GDC is a black box right now. They've kind of moved from a position of begrudging limited transparency to total opacity. And often loved ones are, going to Facebook groups and asking questions there because they're being completely ignored by the GDC. Facebook groups are actually a pretty important part of the ecosystem of advocates and folks with loved ones incarcerated, just trying to stay abreast of what's going on, because it's so hard to get in touch with their loved ones, and it's so impossible to get any kind of meaningful answers from the GDC.
So there's obviously a number of things happening. Let's see if we can break it down a little bit. We know a lot of people died from COVID. How bad was that, at least what they're telling you? And is that how bad is that situation now with Omicron in Georgia?
We would have almost no idea because, again, the GDC has moved to this position of opacity. At the beginning of the pandemic, and I will say they have never done this well, so the bar was always very low, but at the beginning of the pandemic, with some gentle pushing from advocates, they had a COVID tracker, which at one point had, facility by facility cases, deaths. I believe they were even tracking vaccinations. And over the summer, this past summer, 2021, at the height of the Delta surge, the GDC put out a press release that basically said, we're no longer going to be keeping the COVID tracker up. Cases are so low, we have a 97% survival rate or something very heinous like that. And we haven't seen anything since then. So again, sort of trying to cobble together information from hearing from folks inside, hearing from family members and loved ones, trying to suss out what the situation is at each prison. But yeah, the honest answer is that we know very little because the GDC is not reporting any of this.
So it sounded like maybe I don't know in every state, I know a lot of the states, but were they offering vaccinations and boosters in Georgia?
Yes. I have heard from my incarcerated comrades that they were offered boosters. There's, they're not trying very hard to do good education around the vaccines and boosters, but it is being offered and people are certainly taking them. But I mean, given, Georgia had its worst numbers by far during the Omicron surge, and we know that prisons are not separate from society in any way. So I feel confident in saying that there was a very bad surge, but we know so little. We have so little data, and that's a huge problem.
And you may again not have the answer to this, but what is their policy on testing and vaccinating officers?
No idea. No idea.
Again, I'm feeling very lucky to be in Michigan right now.
Yeah.
Where I can literally just write them and they answer my questions. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I don't relate to that at all.
So next, and I don't know if you're going to have answers to this one either, we have homicides. You noted that there were a lot of people who'd been killed in Georgia prisons over that same period of time.
Yep.
What factors do you attribute the high levels of violence to? We already talked about overstaffing.
Yep. Well, I should start by saying a very obvious point, which is that the conditions that create the greatest risk of violence and harm are all within prisons. Unsafe living conditions, constant exposure to violence, no access to medical care, no access to mental health care, institutional racism, all of this, all of the things that we know contribute to violence on the outside are rife throughout prisons. So that's sort of a baseline. Like, of course, there are places of violence because there are places of great danger through both medical neglect, the people who are, allegedly in charge of keeping you safe, who are often a source of great danger. We also know that violence is contagious. It's rare for someone to enter into violence by committing it. Usually someone has been a victim of it first. And if we sort of apply that public health lens to it, it makes a lot of sense that there are murders within prisons. That said, obviously, all of the stressors of the pandemic have contributed to that hugely. Understaffing has contributed to that. And Georgia's rampant use of solitary confinement, which just causes everyone to decompensate. All of these factors, which, are worsened right now, but I want to be clear, are just a part of incarceration. I think it's unsurprising that there are such high rates of violence right now.
And we talked about staffing. We'll probably talk about it a little more in a second. But another problem seems to be related to mental health treatment, or the lack of mental health treatment, and the high number of suicides. I know when I went, when I first went to jail before I even went to prison, I had, I've told this story before, but I had no experience at all. I'd never been arrested for anything. And they asked me the screening questions. And I said, yeah, I'm a little depressed because it had been a pretty bad day. And next thing I knew, I was in a 24-hour observation cell and then put in solitary for like a week, which, as I'm sure you can guess, made my depression much better.
Yeah, that's it. Problem solved.
Yeah. So part of the reason many people go to prison is that they're dealing with trauma and mental illness, and prison then adds whole new levels of depression, anxiety, stress, and helplessness. I'm guessing the answer is not going to be very good, but how were they handling mental illness in Georgia's prisons?
Yeah, very poorly, very poorly. I'll give the example of Georgia State Prison, which has actually been slated to close. We can talk about that a bit more later, but it is the prison in Georgia where often, if incarcerated people are facing really serious mental health challenges that the prison that they're in doesn't feel equipped to address, they will be transferred to GSP. The reason that Southern Center filed this lawsuit against GSP was because people were being transferred there as a result of their mental illness and then being placed into solitary confinement immediately. In a lot of cases, never seeing a mental health counselor, never being offered medication, no therapeutic programming, just, sitting in these unbelievably decrepit, disgusting cells, staring at cinder block walls for days, weeks, months on end. There's just even the prisons with the best medical staffing are not going to be able to do good work because you cannot heal someone in a carceral setting. Those are concepts that butt up against each other. And I would say that it's pretty rare to be offered anything resembling meaningful healthcare in any carceral setting in Georgia. So I wish I had one good anecdote to share about that, but I really don't.
Yeah. So I could go through, we could talk about, obviously there's a lot of really bad conditions in these prisons. There's, lack of medical care. There's all kinds of problems. But I mean, really, that's endemic in every prison system in the United States.
Yep.
And something is making Georgia uniquely deadly right now. I mean, and there's some pretty bad prison systems across the country. So do you have any feel for why it's uniquely so bad in Georgia right now? Is there anything that you could just even put your mind around that says this might be it, or, you know?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that things have never been good in Georgia's prisons. And, you know, like you said, that's a blanket statement. That's true of every prison system everywhere because of what prisons are and what they do to people. But Georgia has been a state that we're addicted to incarcerating people. The levels of people both incarcerated or under some kind of correctional control in Georgia make us exceptional in a very bad way. And I think that addiction to incarceration and this knee-jerk response that punishment and caging is the right way to respond to any kind of harm. We're seeing the results of decades of those policies. And it seems a little simplistic, but you know, the first thing that I think of as an answer to that question is just the sheer number of people who are in the system. And even that has been, you know, it fluctuates, but it's at a lower number than it has been in recent years. And it is still far, 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 far too many people. So just, you know, initially looking at the number of incarcerated people versus staff is telling. I don't think that the numbers we're seeing are consistent with other states. There are multiple prisons that are operating with, you know, vacancy rates of 70%. I don't know the data from other states, but I would guess that Georgia
Definitely,
is,
with rare exceptions. I mean, we had a recent crisis at our women's prison, and it was like probably the first time they'd been at like a 60% deficit, mostly because of COVID. So,
yes.
You know, I don't think that's if that's a normal figure for them, that's pretty bad.
Yeah. And, you know, according to the GDC's own data, I think in 2019, so this is pre-COVID, 71% of correctional officers quit in the same year that they were hired. So it's just always been an awful job to have, and it's gotten considerably worse during the pandemic. And again, we run into these tricky questions of how much do we want to lift up COs as the answer to this? Because they're not the answer. These issues violence is still endemic to incarceration. There will still be these levels of suicides and homicides, but in a lot of cases, you need people there.
Yeah, I mean, having done time myself, look, I mean, there are times and there are officers who are professional. I'm not going to say that they are do the best job in the world or make the place a rosy place, but there are definitely officers who, you know, actually do what they're supposed to do and help folks. And then there are a lot of officers who don't, you know, I mean, like, it's just a question of, and if you don't have, you know, I mean, you know, I remember, you know, we'd have what are called unit officers. And usually the way you get decided if you were a unit officer is if you weren't someone who got in a lot of trouble all the time or got in a lot of fights or got in a lot of incidents as an officer. And the officers that had the most trouble would get put in like the yard, but at certain times when they could, you know, they wouldn't usually be unit officers. And if you have a shortage, you're probably not going to have the opportunity to make sure that the people who are the best officers are in the places where they could actually do the best job. And I'm not saying that, you know, the answer to anything is officers, but, you know, I mean, they built a prison based around that model. And so we may not think that model could ever be successful, but it certainly can't be successful if it isn't even being operated, you know, in a safe manner, you know, and
talking about deaths by suicide is a good example of, you know, I've heard multiple stories, from folks who are, you know, in a dorm where there was a suicide and there was, you know, people clanging on the bars, trying really, really hard to get CO's attention. And there just simply aren't people there to come and check. And there are going to be more deaths if there are fewer correctional officers.
Well, and like you said, they've set the mousetrap up in a lot of ways so that they have immediate control over things that are necessary to the running of the prison.
Right.
and the functional, just
basic
people being able to
functions.
move on their basic functions. And so if they're not there, I mean, it's like almost like that, the Stephen King book, The Stand, where the pandemic comes in the prison and knocks everybody out except for the people who are, immune to so there's like 5 people and they're still locked in their cells and can't get out. I mean, they're just sitting there, I imagine that's sort of what it's like when you don't have enough officers to do the job. That sometimes you're just stuck in pretty bad situations.
Yep. Yeah. So I think Georgia prisons have been dangerous since their inception. They have never been safe, but I think that this is unseen levels of staffing shortages. And again, just going back to that ratio, if the ratio is that off, there are going to be countless preventable deaths that wouldn't have happened if there had been staff there to intervene.
One of the mistakes I think I don't want to replicate today is kind of creating this notion that there's a generic prison, and because most people assume that generic prison is probably men. And there's also, a lot of problems that are uniquely going on right now. It seems like from the stuff that you sent me with the women's prisons in Georgia. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. There are truly heinous conditions at Lee Arundel State Prison. Southern Center has sent 2 letters to the warden there last year, just, outlining the horrific conditions that are persisting. And again, like we've talked about, some of this is conditions, really disgusting cells with defective plumbing and electricity, very, very little access to hygiene supplies, chronic mold infestations that have very serious health impacts, inedible food, all of these things that are the result of the state not caring about the facilities at all. Also at Arundel, women in the immediate postpartum period, which I don't think I need to explain, is one of the more vulnerable and dangerous times in a mother's life, have been subjected to egregious conditions, days after giving birth, sometimes still wearing clothes with blood on it, and then put into solitary confinement. We detailed the story of one mother in this letter to the warden who was asking for days for some kind of medical intervention for infected stitches and just received absolutely nothing. She had to remove her own stitches with a toenail clipper because she was being ignored. Another new mom had to wait, I think, close to a month to get iron for her anemia. She wasn't given ibuprofen for cramping. Just utterly heinous conditions that are also, very illegal, although we can talk a bit more about that later on. And again, this is Lee Arundel Prison, one of the more understaffed prisons in the state as well.
I was going to say there's a unique problem with women's prisons because they usually require a higher level of staff training and often require gender-specific officers. Is that not? I don't know if that's true in Georgia, but it's definitely true in Michigan. So I'm
not sure about the additional training, but that sounds believable.
So one of the solutions you see for all this, at least in the article you wrote, is not surprisingly letting a bunch more people out of prison.
Yep.
Again, we're getting back to, I'm not asking the tough questions today. I'm just rolling with the somewhat, what you'd think would be common sense solutions.
You would think.
Georgia's commutation process is different than most states I've heard of and actually is run by the parole board. Is that right?
Yes, the parole board has an incredible amount of power in Georgia.
So
they have exclusive authority over basically all executive clemency. So
the governor can't do anything. It's just the parole board.
That's right.
Wow.
Yep.
Do you have any idea why that I've never heard of that before? Is that one of those things where the governor commuted someone and the legislator got mad and took away all the governor's power, or was it something else?
I don't think so. I don't think that the governor ever had that power in Georgia. Yeah, it's a very...
That is so weird. I've gone back to the Federalist Papers and read about the creation of commutation, and it had always been a sole executive power for a governor or president. That's interesting.
Yeah. So the parole board the governor has their hands on this in some ways, in that they appoint the members of the parole board. But yeah, it's five people who shift on, I believe, 7-year terms. And they're incredibly, incredibly powerful, and also incredibly unknown. You know, the folks who are on the current board are not household names by any stretch of the imagination.
They all have, it sounded like all law enforcement and prosecutorial backgrounds. Is that?
Yes, that is true of the current makeup of the board. And I would be willing to venture to say that that's always been true of the board. Various, one was a district attorney, various folks with experience in, I think, a former state trooper, some people who've worked within prisons. They're incredibly powerful. Truly, they alone determine when incarcerated people can be released and when they get their rights restored, and they issue pardons, they commute death sentences. They're incredibly powerful, and they face very little scrutiny.
And here's another thing that's going to make people's heads spin that's definitely unique to Georgia that I've seen, at least. You don't have parole hearings. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep. We don't have, it's not even just that there are closed door parole hearings that the public isn't privy to. There are not hearings. The way that it works is that the board, each member of the parole board votes on their own without discussing the case with one another either, and obviously without discussing the case with the person in question. And then once 3 of the 5 members have voted one way or another, case closed, move right along. The incarcerated person themselves is completely shut out of the process. There's no input from the communities that they're going to be rejoining. It's an entirely, it's a black box.
And I think you quoted the director of the parole board saying that it still allows all stakeholders to participate, then listed the stakeholders out and didn't include the incarcerated people or their families.
Yep. Yeah, very telling who they consider the stakeholders to be.
Yeah, and so you have the pandemic, you have what I would have to say in any other state would be considered, and maybe, certainly at the federal level would be considered a crisis, a human rights crisis. And it sounded like from what you wrote, in the years of the pandemic, they've released essentially the same amount of people that they would release in any other year. Is that correct?
Yep. That's absolutely right. If not slightly fewer. There was just no indication that they were seeing the crisis that we are seeing, although we know that, of course, they are actually aware.
Oh my goodness!
A little context to this. So, in 2020,
I just want to restate this. They have the power to commute anyone they want to. I'm sure there's some limitations, but it sounded like the way you were explaining it, they have a pretty wide ability to commute. And then they have the people who are up for parole, and they still are paroling less people despite 450 people dying in the prisons and COVID.
Yep. And they also there's a provision of the state's charter that says that the board can parole any person who is aged 62 or older, no questions asked. They have these tools, and they are choosing not to use them. I'm really trying to reframe how we think about this in the state. Like, this isn't inaction on the part of the parole board. This is them taking the action to keep people in these incredibly dangerous conditions.
It sounded like you even have something like earned credits where people can reduce their time, but then the parole board can just ignore them. Is that?
Yes, pick points. It's another entirely arbitrary process that I just spoke with someone a couple of weeks ago who had been, working incredibly hard for these pick points, doing a lot of courses, checking all the boxes, essentially doing everything that the parole board had said that they needed to do in order to gain their freedom. And then the pick points were decided not to, the parole board said they didn't count. There's no space for the person to ask why. There's no explanation given. They just give this form letter, and that's that. Again, just a black box.
I think you told the story in your article about someone who had been given a parole decision, asked if they could stay in prison for a little longer to accumulate a better reentry plan. And then when they came back up, they got denied, and the board just said, well, we have new information or something like that.
That's right. There was a 6-month period. This person expressed, wanting a little bit more time to get things in order, figure out where they were going to be living. Again, they had been offered the chance at parole. They said they didn't feel ready. They went before the board again 6 months later, and the board had changed its mind. And crucially, these are all considered state secrets. So again, the person themselves, the person whose very freedom they're deliberating, is not privy to the information that made them change their mind.
So can you not appeal the parole board's decision?
No.
There's no higher power you can go to or anything like that?
Nope. The buck stops there.
Wow. There's not even an ombuds or anything like that. There's nothing.
In some cases, getting a parole denial could mean you don't go before the board for years, 6 more years. These are incredibly serious decisions that are being made flippantly, I feel confident saying. And if the parole board would like to test me on that, I would love to see more information, because without any of that, the public is left to say, okay, there's a humanitarian crisis of truly unreal proportions unfolding in our state prisons, and the parole board is not making any kind of affirmative action to get people out. Like I said, they could parole anyone over the age of 62. I think
also the people who are generally the most at risk of COVID. So,
yes.
The ones that cost the prison system the most in many different ways. And, and the ones that are, I've seen research that says that people who have done over 5 years and are over the age of 50 have less than a 1% recidivism rate. So are, probably the least risk.
And we have roughly 3,700 people over the age of 60 in Georgia prisons. And let's just start right there. That would be a meaningful thing to just release those people. And the board is choosing not to do that. It is a conscious action.
So we know, and this is where, a lot of my friends sometimes refer to me as Eeyore, because I'm always kind of cynical about the possibility. I fight all the time to change things, and I've, had a little bit of luck, but, on the whole, I think that we're climbing a very large mountain, and sometimes that mountain we're not as close to the top as we'd like to believe that we are. We know that the Eighth Amendment has been reduced kind of to barely a shell of what it should be by the courts. And we've seen, for instance, 3 DOJ reports in Alabama result in virtually no meaningful relief, but we have seen new prisons getting built. Mm-hmm. Instead of getting any of the fix and problems fixed, someone's getting a lot of money to buy, fancy new boxes. Mm-hmm. Is there a path to fixing what would have to be, is there a feasible path to at least starting to make changes in a very conservative state in crisis in Georgia?
Yes.
And that's a big question, I know.
I have to believe that there is. And, Georgia is a conservative state, but even Governor Deal, who was in office prior to Governor Kemp, was less carcerally minded than his predecessors. The bar is still incredibly low, of course, but there was some meaningful reduction in the general prison population under his tenure. And I remain optimistic that a hard look at the history of Georgia's prisons and a reminder that we have been stuck in this cycle of crises for as long as the Georgia Department of Corrections has existed, I think if we keep reminding ourselves of that, and if advocates and organizers are able to remind others in the state of that, it's obvious that this is not the way to safety. Like, we have all of the data, we've got it right there, we have the history. It's a matter of shifting perception away from the idea that punishment and caging is the only response to harm. And I feel heartened by the ways in which nationally this dialogue has shifted in ways that even I wouldn't have anticipated over the last 2 years. So I choose to remain optimistic that Georgia will continue to learn from its mistakes, that it will start to release people, that it will put money towards front-end initiatives that keep people out of cages. And of course, I could have answered that very differently and had data to back that up too, but this work could be so demoralizing in that way that I am consciously choosing to stay optimistic because I don't think there's an option.
I mean, I told people many times that the main way that I survived, my time incarcerated was by constantly lying to myself. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but about how good the day was, even when it was a terrible day,
exactly.
Like, I'm very good. I figured if I could mislead myself in bad ways, which is how I got in prison, I could certainly mislead myself in ways that were positive.
In good ways. There you go. Radical optimism.
Yeah.
I will also say that I am heartened by what I see as increased collaboration and community and relationships between folks on the outside and folks on the inside. And I think that is going to be how we get to a more liberatory future. And I'm heartened by what I'm seeing there. So yeah, radical optimism, maybe I'm lying to myself. But
well, I'm just saying, even if it keeps getting you up every day to fight the fight, that's probably worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's what I do, but it seems to work for me now. I know that's what I did when I was incarcerated.
Yep.
Another problem seems to be that people outside of prison seem to consider kind of whatever happens to people in prisons as just desserts. Do you have kind of thoughts about what we need to do as a communications person, what we need to do to be more effective at changing hearts and minds? And I struggle with this question on a daily basis. So
yeah, honestly, I struggle with this too, because sometimes I worry that when we're leaning on these sort of morality-based arguments for keeping people out of prison, stressing that people who are caged aren't bad people. And I worry that we're just kind of using the language of the oppressive systems. I feel less that sort of moralizing about each person behind bars is the way to go, and more that we just need to look at cold, hard fact. There has never been data that shows that incarceration makes communities safer. I don't love using this word, but it is criminogenic. A crime is obviously a social construct, not the same as harm, but we know that putting people in these cages and then releasing them does not make them better neighbors than they were before. So I think it's very important that we give platforms to impacted people. Nothing bothers me more than communications strategies and tactics that sort of seem to imply that people inside are voiceless, and that...
I really hate when people say I'm a voice for the voiceless, because I know for a fact they have voices.
Right. They have voices. They don't have microphones.
I remember being in a particular one of the prisons I was in, where all night people would serenade you with those voices. So they definitely have voices.
They certainly do. Yeah. And this is also, it's hard to get incarcerated people's stories out there. I struggle with this, and I worry about this with my job all the time. Connecting folks with journalists is sometimes really great, and sometimes can result in really horrible retaliation against the person. This calculus of is it worth it for you to potentially, re-traumatize yourself in telling this story, to open yourself up for retaliation, just to, be quoted in a paper where people are going to read it and then immediately gloss over what you have to say? So there's a lot of factors that go into thinking about how to lift up incarcerated folks' stories. I honestly forget what the original question you asked me was. Something about storytelling.
Yeah, it was how can we be more effective at changing hearts and minds, I think.
That's right. Yeah. I think that I am not in a position to be doing that. I would like to be sort of leading from behind here and helping to raise up these stories when it feels right, and not pushing people to tell their stories out of some kind of...
I definitely agree that you need to you need to put the spotlight on people who are directly impacted and people who've done time. But I also think it's an all hands on deck thing. I agree with you that sometimes leading from the behind can be very effective. But man, I mean, we got a lot of work to do. I mean, I know we need to get the praxis right.
Exactly.
And that's tough too. But I mean, sometimes we just have to do the work, however it gets done. And as long as we're not exploiting people,
Yeah. And not exploiting people is the key. And I think it's easier than folks would like to believe to unintentionally exploit folks. Especially when we're talking about storytelling.
Wouldn't it be nice if some of those media folks would anonymize the person instead of so you don't get them in trouble and get them
right,
like they do with every other kind of story.
Yeah, even then there's the risk of retaliation if the story is specific enough, or
if you're
the entire dorm
absolutely
will just be put on lockdown. It's always a risk. It's always a risk.
Yeah, it is. That's for sure. And this brings us to kind of the question of the media. Obviously, we on the organizing side have a huge disadvantage in that we don't have, in many cases, the same ready access to media as do the media arms of law enforcement, including prosecutors.
Yep.
And as a communications person, have you thought about what we can do? Because there's another thing I think about all the time, because we do somewhat similar work.
Yeah.
What we can do to kind of counteract this, most all of our organizations have to spend all their time even getting to the point where something can get done, and then it gets done, and then the backlash starts, and we don't have the capacity built up a lot of the time to effectively deal with the backlash, or even have access to the people that would allow us to counteract the backlash. So I don't know. What do you think on the problem of kind of media deficits?
Oh, I could talk about this for hours. The thing that I'll talk about first is that I think this is a very, very hard system to cover. It is incredibly confusing and opaque and, varies from county to county sometimes. I think it's hard even for lawyers, and we're expecting folks, especially local news, they're probably covering multiple different disparate, complicated systems. And like you said, when you have more access to police and district attorneys and maybe officials in the GDC than you do advocates or incarcerated people, the dominant narrative is going to be the one that comes from folks in positions of power. So I think one thing that can be done, and I'm seeing this starting to happen in multiple places in really exciting ways, is just educating journalists who cover these systems in multiple ways. One, to help them actually understand the legal system and the processes, and that includes understanding how prisons work, understanding how the grievance process works, and the ways in which the PLRA is, stunting folks' ability to litigate, and all of these things that don't really sound sexy or important, but I think really impact the tone and tenor of coverage. And then I also think having formerly incarcerated people training journalists is incredibly important. And I'm starting to see more of that, and I'm really optimistic that continues, because in my experience, often coverage that frankly is inaccurate is often because, again, you've heard from police and their stenographers first, and then you go to the DA for a comment or even a local elected official. And they just don't have a good understanding of how incarceration works in practice. So I feel optimistic about increased training, both in terms of understanding weird legal issues, as well as understanding, like, what was it like to be incarcerated? And once you have those things, I think the coverage will start to be a little bit more reflective of reality. You know, it's not ideal that it's very hard to visit prisons and jails. I feel like I've said phrase black box at least 20 times on this conversation, but it's really, really, really hard to get information. And that has been especially true, obviously, during the pandemic.
You know, one thing I think, you know, I mean, it's going to sound like I'm being critical. It's not, because people who do, you know, organizations who do the work that, you know, of, you know, be it decarceration, reentry, whatever, you know, it's incredibly hard and a lot of times frustrating work. And people have, you know, specific things that they're trying to get done in a particular year, and they get stuck on their things, and it's hard to see the forest through the trees a lot of the time. But I feel like certain times, every single organization in the United States, there should be like a universal bat signal. It's like, you know, all of us just say, hey, Georgia, that can't continue, you know? You know, like all of us, every single person should be screaming from every place, just even if it's just for a week, you know, just say 450 deaths is not okay. You know, I mean, that's not okay. And all of us believe that. I mean, everyone from, you know, the ACLU to you know, the local reentry organization, everybody believes that. But for some reason, because whatever, we're all stuck in these, you know, in our silos or whatever, we don't ever put the bat signal out. And I think, you know, there are certain times when the bat signal really needs to be out. And this is one of those times. Do you have any kind of thoughts on how we can, you know, actually, you know, put the, you know, I don't know, bat signal is probably not the best, you know, but the bat signal out and get everybody screaming. Because, I mean, we all really should, at times like this, when I mean, this is a real human rights disaster. We really should all be screaming to the high heavens about this.
Yep. Well, I think the equivalent of the bat symbol in the legal world is going to the DOJ and requesting intervention. And that is what's happening right now. The DOJ Civil Rights Division is doing a sweeping system-wide investigation of the Georgia Department of Corrections as a result of these really unheard of levels of death and despair. But that's a very slow process.
And we also have seen that, you know, in Alabama, there were 3 very scathing reports of Alabama prisons. I've read every word of them.
And lo and behold, they're building more prisons there.
And not fake. I mean, I'd actually, you know, I mean, obviously not for prisons, but, you know, if that's the way they want to spend their money, you know, whatever. But, you know, that, you know, if they're not fixing any of the problems, then they're not fixing any of the problems.
No.
You know, like if they were doing both end, I might be able to, but they're not. They're just building the new shiny boxes. Most of their problems were, you know, violence, a lot of it created by correctional officers. I haven't seen any initiatives on that. So, I mean, I get what you're saying, but I mean, you know, really, even if it was just, you know, once a week, if every organization in the United States just said, Georgia, you suck, you know, I mean, just to remind, you know, so I mean, I've seen, look, I've personally, I'm sure you've seen, you know, led a couple of Twitter events, just Twitter events that nationally trended, got some national press, things like that. Just for me, you know, if all of us work together on these things, you know, just even in a small period of time, sometimes I think we can move the needle, because people do actually respond to bad press. If you get them, you know, if they feel like a lot of people are screaming, you're doing something wrong, they pay a lot more attention than if nobody's saying it, you know?
Yeah, I have not seen that borne out here. The GDC has been getting horrible press for decades. And I mean, frankly, the response over the last 24-ish months has been really telling. Like I said, going from issuing regular press releases when someone in their care dies by homicide or suicide, and then having these unprecedented spikes in death, and stopping those press releases, having the Delta surge in the summer and right in the middle of it, stopping COVID reporting. What we're seeing is that the GDC responds to this pressure by retreating further. And, this is why I wrote about the parole board, because there has been this question over the last 2 years in Georgia of what do we do? Who is in power here? Who is in a position to be lobbied? What can advocates do? And when you have this tiny group,
Georgia's a tourism state. I mean, and they have a lot of media that work out there. I just feel like, we should, I don't know. I'm going to try to do so. I don't know what I can do, but I'm going to try to raise some ruckus at some point, because this is
I'm here for that. I think ruckus raising is absolutely what needs to happen.
Because I'm sure as hell not going to Georgia as long as this is the case. And I know maybe my dollars aren't that big, but
Yeah. That's, a collective action is necessary. And we've seen some really great, there's infrastructure to do this in Georgia. I also want to say that I think the pandemic has made this harder. But there's been some incredible work done by mothers whose children were killed or died in GDC custody, who have, banded together and have done banner drops outside of these prisons and are just doing everything in their power to raise awareness about this crisis. And
there is nothing more powerful. There is nothing more powerful than moms, man. Parents. We have to be reckoned with. I've seen parents walking around the Capitol building here in Michigan, with pictures of their kids around their neck who are incarcerated. Yeah. And it's just so powerful when they go office to office. And maybe it's not the same in Georgia, but it does make a difference. I have to believe it makes a difference when people actually meet someone and make that connection. And
I think, this hearing that was held in September in Georgia had testimony from multiple mothers whose sons had been killed. In one instance, this woman got absolutely no information from the prison about her son's death. Basically, everything she learned was from his friends who shared information through, an obviously contraband cell phone. Just to not even have the decency or the obligation to tell a grieving mother what happened to her child while in state care. That to me shows you where the bar is, and just how little they care and how little they care about public opinion, which is shocking to me, but it's true.
Well, I could probably keep going for another hour and a half, but
me too.
People really like that I asked this last year. I've been asking if there's any criminal justice related books that you might recommend to others.
Ooh, okay. Sorry. I'm going to have to say Until We Reckon, in part because it's right behind you. But also there are maybe 5 books that I think have fundamentally changed the way that I think about big systems. And Until We Reckon is one of them. Just a really clear, cohesive argument against incarceration that is moving and powerful, and I really recommend it to everyone. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, it's an excellent book, and I'm glad I had it right behind me when you're talking about it. That's good.
Exactly.
I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked but did not? Oh, and you're back for the last question.
You're very choppy in my ear, but I can mostly hear you. Can you say that last one more time?
Sure. I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked but did not? Aside from the hearing problem, what did I mess up?
I don't think you messed anything up. I think it would be good to talk a little bit more about Kemp's plan to build new prisons in Georgia, since this is coming at quite a coincidental time, the absolute worst crisis in the department's history. And now we're going to give them $600 million to keep torturing people, despite what we know. aside from that, I'm trying to think.
Well, does anything in his $600 million plan suggest that they're going to address any of the actual problems aside from the boxes?
I'll let you guess.
I'm going to guess no.
Absolutely nothing. This is, 2 new prisons because these facilities are old. And again, Georgia State Prison is one of them, but they're planning now to build another new prison in that same county, a county that already houses 2 other prisons, Tattnall County, Georgia. And yeah, maybe there will be more of a clear campaign about this as the budget is more, finalized, and that probably won't be until the end of March. But I think we have quite a fight on our hands here in Georgia. And again, a real allegory to what's going on in Alabama, both under investigation by DOJ, both still in positions to be like, nope, the way to deal with this is to pour a lot more money into new prisons, which obviously never does anything. In Georgia, the NAACP is suing one of our newest prisons, the Coffee County Correctional Facility. And a lot of the issues are conditions, water running down the walls at night, and it was renovated in 2009. So,
yeah, I kind of have gotten to the point where, I had a webinar with John Pfaff a couple months ago that wasn't the podcast. It was a webinar we did together. And, he kind of was like, look, we got to stop fighting this battle because it's just getting us off topic all the time. He's talking about policing at that point. So why not just say, yeah, whatever, you're spending money on police, but are you fixing any of these problems?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it's like, I kind of feel like, I guess they're going to build their prisons if they're going to build their prisons. I think there's other questions we should be asking them, like, okay, well, are you retiring some of the prisons that you're building the new ones?
Right.
Here are the 10 problems that your prisons had. How will building the new prison make mental health care better? How will make, all those things. And, I don't know if we can, I hope we someday can stop them from building new prisons, but in the world where they're just going to do that, we need to find ways to make them actually solve the, from a from someone who has a lot of friends inside and did time.
Harm reduction.
I try to take a harm reductionist stance and just be like, okay, but what are you doing to fix the problems, dude?
Exactly. Like if the General Assembly in this state is committed to remedying the crisis in prisons by allocating these additional funds to the GDC, then those funds should be used to ensure that medical and mental health needs of incarcerated people are met in a timely manner. It should ensure educational, employment, substance abuse treatment programming, which promotes safety inside.
If you want, go ahead and spend all the money you want on building the box, but then could you also allocate another $500 million for the stuff that actually is the problem?
Exactly. Exactly. But even then, we get to I'm
not saying it's an answer. I'm just saying it's I just get so frustrated by these nonsensical answer. Like, there's a gigantic problem. Well, we'll just, pay off someone to build a whole bunch of shit and then it'll all go away. Pardon my French. I usually don't curse on this, but.
Well, I curse like a sailor, so you're in good company.
I never do. That's like one of the only times I just slipped out. I don't know.
Well, that's Georgia Department of Corrections will do that to you.
Apparently, yeah.
Utterly maddening. Okay, I want to think through if there's any other points that we didn't hit on.
Well, I'm really, regardless of, as you're thinking, I'm really glad we got to do this because one thing I try to do but don't get to do enough is talk about different prison systems throughout the country.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people listening probably don't know anything about the Georgia prison system. And I'll admit I didn't know much about it until, I try to keep up on what's going on in most of the prison systems. But, this is one, like you're saying, that's enough of a black box. I just haven't come across enough of the stuff to know. So
I really think a lot of people in this state are not aware of what's going on. But a lot of people are because there are so many people impacted by this. 46,000 people in prisons. Think of the web, the hundreds of thousands of people who are impacted by this every day. Sometimes when I think about that, I'm just like, how how are we not all going out and screaming at 7 p.m. from our terraces? I go back to the same place that you're at, which is a bit of astonishment at how terrifying conditions are and how this happened with any other state agency. It would be a scandal, and it doesn't seem to be one.
I think it's a scandal. I don't know. I still can't.
I agree.
I have 450 people, man. That's just...
Yeah. And it's hard to wrap your head around. It is.
I mean, it's
unconscionable.
Yeah. It's terrible.
Yep.
Well, on that note, I really I really thank you for doing this, and it's really good to see you face to face. We've talked for a while, but this is the first time we've actually kind of looked at each other for most of this.
Yeah.
And, it's nice to get to say hello. So thanks again.
Thank you. And I really feel like so many of these, they're great questions, and I wish I had clearer answers to them. The fact that I don't have clearer answers is indicative of the problem, I think.
Yeah, thanks again. I mean, hopefully we'll all get to work on building the bat channel. I don't know, the bat signal,
Let's do that. That's part of my radical optimism. It's the collective that is fighting this. That gives me hope, and that powers me to keep going.
Me too. It's a lot of great people. So thanks again.
It is. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. You can learn more about this episode in the notes or visit our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, and please like this episode and leave comments below. Special thanks to Andrew Stein, who does the editing and post-production for me, to Ann Espo for helping with our transcripts and social media images, and to Alex Mayo, who helps with our website and does the video transcription. Make sure and add us on social media and share our posts across your network. Also thanks to my employer, Safe and Just Michigan, for helping to support the Decarceration Nation podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. See you next time.